Hello, and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. Today, we're going to be taking a look at something that's a little bit different from the topics that we've previously discussed. The first time we talked about sort of overview for general time periods, then we looked at their art, but I felt like we were still missing something. And before we can really go too much further into more esoteric and more specific topics, we really need to have a solid foundation for this concept called strategy. Now, you may have heard of strategy or you may have never heard of strategy, but either way, this is something that even without acknowledging it, everyone uses every single day of their life. So basically, what is strategy? Well, strategy is a plan of action or a policy designed to achieve some sort of goal. It sounds a little broad, and it really is. Originally, strategy was mostly seen through the lens of warfare. In the ancient Greek strategikon, in the word stratagem, in a lot of these concepts, strategy was seen as a means of using military might to achieve some sort of goal. But through this series, I hope to show and to prove that not only was strategy a necessary part of war, which will be a totally separate series that we end up doing here, strategy is a necessary part of everyday life. Human beings, animals, just about anything that's alive, needs to achieve certain goals in order to prosper, to flourish, and to spread. In order to finish your education, in order to get that job that you really want, in order to do anything, you have to have, even at the most basic level, some sort of strategic concept and some sort of strategic thinking. So, as I mentioned, most texts and most literature that we have regarding strategy are focused on war up to about the 19th century, and this doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing there for you. There are a lot of really fantastic resources in a lot of these timeless books on strategy that have actually been revived and recycled for the new century and the past century. There are strategic planners for businesses, for election campaigns, for just about anything that you can think of. The reason why is because learning to think strategically is a very excellent way to improve your life and to achieve the goals that you have set out for yourself. But this is another one of those things where you can't just build a strategy out of nowhere. You need to understand how people in the past did it, what a natural strategy looks like, and what the basic elements are, since they really haven't changed all that much through the century. So, in this video, we're going to look at the prehistoric roots of strategy. We're also going to look a little bit at the ancient Egyptians and their strategy. We aren't going to be looking at a whole lot of war strategy through this series, but we will be learning to think strategically and to see the way that different types of strategies helped different civilizations flourish, survive, and stave off their impending doom, which does come to just about any civilization at any time. There are some strategic thinkers, such as Sun Tzu, which we won't be able to cover in this series. This is mostly going to be on Western strategy, but we will be able to glean a lot from these different great people, these different great times, into how to set up a plan to achieve your goals, and how to learn to use the different basics of strategy given to us by nature and by our ancestors. So, to start our look at strategy, I'm going to go back a little bit further, or maybe just in a slightly different direction to start out with. We normally begin with ancient civilizations, which we will get to in the second part of this episode, but right now we're going to take a look at natural strategy, or the way that strategically thinking animals can help get what they want and organize their own methods into achieving goals. So we're going to take a real quick look at apes and specifically chimpanzees because, as it turns out, they have a lot of the basics of strategy, which will form the rock bed of all other strategic thinking for just about the rest of the history of strategic thinking. So there are three basics to strategy from nature, and those include coalition forming, which, if you haven't heard the word coalition yet, you're going to hear it a lot on this channel. Different grand coalitions, the allies in not only World War II and World War I, but just about every war in the 19th century. Great Britain was very good at securing coalitions to help get their needs met. Coalitions are when groups form from smaller, less strong, less capable members to overthrow or to compete with someone who has more power, more security, and less need for cooperation. So in addition to coalitions, we also have deception. Now, deception is very interesting. Not every animal can engage in deception. In order to properly pull this off, you need something called empathy. Empathy is very different from sympathy. I'm going to go over this quickly here because I'd like to go a lot more in depth into this sort of thing, especially in my Rome video, and we will do that, but just a basic overview. Empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy is a reaction you get seeing someone in distress and wanting to help. Empathy is being able to understand where someone is coming from or what they are feeling. Some of the most empathetic people alive today are actually poker players. Now hang on for a second. Why would a poker player, someone who is seen as possibly ruthless, be more empathetic than, say, someone who is handing out food or trying to help the people around them? Well, in order to properly bluff, in order to properly deceive, the poker player needs to understand what the other people at the table are potentially thinking, and maybe what they have, what they're feeling, what their tells are. And another one of these extremely empathetic people from history was Augustus Caesar. And we'll take a look probably a little bit more at Julius Caesar with empathy, but especially with Julius Caesar, he knew specifically when to corner his opponent, what they would likely do when cornered, when to run, when his opponent would run. He was constantly thinking about what the next move of his opponents was going to be, and he was very good at anticipating these things and understanding where they were coming from and how they were feeling. So empathy, being able to understand what someone is thinking, what they're feeling, where they're coming from, is a necessary part of deception, because in order to deceive, you must first know what their initial thought will be. Now, back to apes and to chimpanzees, they use deception in very interesting ways. When they begin to fight for dominance, or when they begin to stand off and do that sort of thing, the hairs on their body will stand up to give a larger impression. They will begin to dive at each other without actually coming to blows or getting into a fight in an attempt to intimidate, in the hopes that the other ape will not want to engage. And they will also act behind their backs. If one male is particularly dominant, one male who is lesser or who is trying to unseat the dominant male may go behind his back, giving gifts to the females to try and win over the tribe and to secure his own place of dominance. So, coalitions, deception. The third important part of natural strategy is violence. It is unfortunate that violence is an important part of anything, but if you look at history, if you look at nature, violence does tend to make these sorts of things go round. The law of the jungle is traditionally known as might makes right, but we're going to take a look at this and see that just because one is stronger and bigger and more able to win a fight doesn't necessarily mean that they can wield violence in a way to win or to come out on top. So, how do apes and chimpanzees use coalitions, deception, and violence to vie for the top rank in their tribe? A lot of different researchers have actually looked at chimpanzees in the wild and have studied them for extensive amounts of time, and they came up with some pretty interesting conclusions. As it turns out, it is often not the biggest and strongest and most able to commit violence who is in charge of the group or the pack. A lot of the times, it's actually the most political. Now, which chimp would be the most political? The one who can forge friends and coalitions, who has the ability to think about where other chimps are coming from, how to satisfy their needs so that they will help satisfy his own, how to deceive the stronger and the more capable of inflicting violence in order to work behind their back, in order to get on their friendlier side, and in order to win over the tribe right underneath their feet. And the final part, violence, just because you're a smaller ape, it doesn't mean that you necessarily need to go in and begin fighting, like a prison style thing. You have to get into a fight on your first day to establish dominance, blah blah blah. With chimpanzees, it's a little bit different. There's an old quote from Shakespeare: "Discretion is the better part of valor." And that is equally valid here, as it is there, as it is just about anywhere. So what does that mean, discretion being the better part of valor? You need to know when to be valorous. You need to know when to stand and fight. You can't win every fight, but if you can win every important fight, that's all that really matters. So, if you are a lesser ape and you have a tribe that you're with, you have made friends and forged coalitions, you have deceived the alpha into thinking that you are his subordinate and the tribe is his, then you need to learn when the right time to enact violence is in order to dethrone the alpha ape and secure your position as the new alpha. This is a very flowing position in nature. Usually only one ape will have this kind of status for a couple years at a time at the most, and this is because there's actually a lot of internal politicking that goes in to the average life of these chimpanzees while they're out in the wild. So, again, we're going to take a look at these concepts from a lot of different angles, but deception, coalitions, and violence are the main three natural sources of strategy, which we will see not only with the apes in this case, but also with lots of different human civilizations. And again, like I said, just because violence is a successful tool, that doesn't mean that being violent is a successful strategy. It simply means that there are times when you have to stand, and you have to stand up for yourself, for your friends, and for what you think is right. In the case of a chimp, it's a little bit more simple, but this was a necessary starting point so that we could look at the natural origins of history and move into the next topic, the prehistoric origins of strategy. And next, we're going to look at primitive humans and prehistoric concepts of strategy. This was when sort of disorganized, minor-scale warfare began to break out. We observed these in lots of different groups in the natives of North America and South America, Papua New Guinea, the Australian Aboriginals. lots of these groups still had to vie for resources and to act and think strategically to preserve themselves and their tribes and to maximize the utility that they could get from their surroundings and against the odds and their opponents. So we're going to take a look at those three basic principles of coalitions, deception, and violence again here. First, we're going to start with coalitions. The tribal groups that humans broke down into tended to be between 100 and 150 in total at a maximum. This was what was called an in-group preference. These in-groups would move together, were usually kin and their extended family, and were about the most that a prehistoric or a primitive society could bear in one group or one setting at a time. This is because of the utter scarcity of resources before farming and mass industry and things like that could really help to bolster a civilization and a social group. So in groups, especially in environments where resources were scarce, but also like in North America where resources were a bit more abundant, still came into conflict with one another and showed these three basic forms of strategy in what we'll call their primitive warfare. It's the first organization of groups to fight against each other, but it was a little bit different. You didn't have set-piece battles and armies moving against each other. They used a lot more deception with their violence, but we'll take a look at that in just a second. So, in-groups versus out-groups. This was a way to secure resources for your group and to minimize resources for the outside group. Now, humans were a lot more abundant than their ape predecessors and contemporaries generally were, so they were pressed to have a lot more violence and a lot more complicated ways than these other groups of primates and animals were. The in-group was a way of showing that you not only cared for your group, but that they were willing to support you, and it was very important to a lot of these tribes to have specific ideas of who they were and where they were moving to. So the coalitions that these groups were forming were mostly kin-based, based off of their family and their extended family, and they tended to move together and to look for resources together. So the next one is deception. When we look at deception with humans, we have to look at a concept called escalation. Now, there is escalation in apes and chimpanzees, but it's about the same as the prehistoric and the basic humans, so we're just going to take a look at it here. Escalation is the concept that you don't just go in with your biggest and baddest weapons and just attempt to annihilate everyone. They did sort of do this, and we'll take a look at that when we talk about violence, but it was usually not a first instinct. Generally, it begins with some sort of minor conflict. Two in-groups reach the boundaries of their zones, come into contact with each other, and it usually starts with loud displays. They stand there, they yell at each other, then if no side backs down, they may begin to throw things, sticks and stones and small things not intended to kill or even to wound, but to scare and to intimidate. This is a form of deception because if your group is a little bit smaller, but both of your raiding parties are about the same size, you may want to deceive the other side into thinking that you are more powerful than you actually are in order to scare them off and win resources for your in-group. Escalation is a really interesting idea that we'll see again and again all through time. I mean, even today you can see escalation back and forth between major powers in our world today. So after the throwing of sticks and stones doesn't work, things may come to blows, but in these ancient and prehistoric times, they didn't usually face off en masse. A lot of this actually became ritualized over time. The Papua New Guinea natives would actually have these sort of bizarre wars with each other where they would start with the yelling, and then they would start with the throwing, and then they would actually get shields and spears and throw them at each other. But it wasn't as much to necessarily kill as it was at this point just sort of something that their culture did. Now, in other cultures where resources were more scarce, if you attempted to form a large coalition and that didn't scare your opponent off, you then tried to deceive. If your deception and your escalation didn't scare them off, it was time for violence. So, as I mentioned, they didn't really have large armies and battles the way that we do today. They had two main types of violence and warfare in this time. That was raids and massacres. So we'll start with the less scary sounding one, and then we'll make it to the other. Raids were when one group would, generally in the night and when unsuspecting under the auspices of deception, would enter the camp of the opponent, try to take the weak, the sick, the small as either slaves or trophies, women for obvious reasons, and any food or resources that they might have. These were very successful, they were hard to anticipate, they were hard to fight. If your tribe was asleep by the time you assembled the able-bodied and the men who could fight back, the raiding party may already be gone. Hit-and-run raids were actually a thing that have existed for a long time, leading up to real warfare and to the mass battles. They would actually still conduct raids, especially with cavalry, but raiding has ancient histories, and it does tie to coalitions, deception, and violence, the three basic parts of natural strategy. Now, if you and another group were raiding each other back and forth, one side may escalate to the highest form of prehistoric strategy and warfare, which was the massacre. Now, instead of meeting head-to-head and fighting to settle differences in a sort of Greek polis style of combat, they would skip through that, and they would do similar to with a raid. They would come in the middle of the night, but this time they would not be seeking to take the weak and to take prisoners and to take goods and things like that. They would be looking to kill. They would come in the middle of the night when people were asleep. They would walk very quietly. They would go to all of the able-bodied who were more warriors in their in-group and in their tribe, and they would kill them in the middle of the night. This pretty much solves the problem of the back-and-forth warfare, but like I said, this was the highest form of escalation. This is the sort of thing that would happen after your coalition hadn't warded the group off, your deception hadn't warded them off, and the raids hadn't warded them off. This was a response to larger groups and to fewer available resources, and was the true beginnings of warfare in the Western world and in just about all of the world. So this is where we see the crossover between the natural forms of strategy in groups like Apes and the prehistoric men who really had little to go off of other than the way that nature worked around them. So, thank you very much for watching this episode today. This was the first side of our new episode on the topic of strategy. We're going to be going through just about every time period and looking at their strategy, but again, this is not a history of warfare. That's going to be separate. I just figured that before we did warfare, we need to understand how people got to the point of being able to think this way, what warfare was a response to, and why these different concepts would work and would be used along very similar lines through history. If you like this episode, please leave a comment or a like. If there's something in particular you want to see, something you think I did wrong, anything like that, just leave a comment down below. If you want to continue to see episodes like this, please subscribe. I actually have a few more subscribers than I really thought I would. It's very interesting the way this whole thing works, but having a good time. So if you guys are too, just go ahead and do that down there. If there's anything else that you want to see or you want to say, I have a comment section on my channel. You can leave comments there whenever you want. So until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.